participated, and that's really helpful to get some good feedback about it. And you'll see a summary when you look at it. You'll see a summary of some of the comments at the bottom. And we had some good ones like, not sure if having a meal is a good idea, which is true. We spend a lot of money for, they're really outside of my family that shows up because they love me. We have about 4 people who'd been coming, 3 to 4 people who'd been coming to that. So it's a lot to spend on that. We had some ideas about the possibility of just doing it once a month, having guest speakers come in. So we'll kind of toss all that around and see where it goes. And so also we have Holy Week coming up this Sunday. Make sure that you come to the Easter egg hunt. We're going to have one service, and it is going to start at 10. And then we're going to do an Easter egg hunt kind of immediately following that. So I think it'll be a pretty good time. Maundy Thursday, the service will be in here. The Maundy Thursday service, Palm Sunday service will be in here. Let me not confuse you. The Maundy Thursday service will be in the chapel at 6:30. And then Easter Sunday morning, we will have a sunrise service. I think we're going to meet at 6:45. I think sunrise is supposed to be at 6:55, so we'll meet at 6:45. We'll have a breakfast in here. Debbie is working on coordinating that right now. And then we'll have our 2 other services, the chapel service at 8 and the foundry at 10:30. So it should be a good time. Let's talk about Genesis. We're in Genesis chapter 8 today. So we're at the place where the flood has happened. The ark has come to rest in the mountains of Ararat. And we're going to see kind of how things evolve as we begin to disembark from the ark. So scriptures are holy, and before we consider them, we should pray. Let's do that together. God, we're grateful for today and for the opportunity to be here to learn more about who you are and who you're calling us to be. Pray, God, that your Holy Spirit would work in and through us, that you would open the eyes of our hearts, that you would awaken our spiritual senses, our seeing eyes and our hearing ears, so that we might hear what you have to say to us today and see the direction in which you're guiding us forward. This we ask in your holy name. Amen. Okay. I spent Monday and Tuesday this week at Board of Ordained Ministry interviews. I've been on the Conference Board of Ordained Ministry now for 8 years, so Monday and Tuesday were my last interviews. We do 2 quadrenniums, so 8 years total. I came off, we spent Monday and Tuesday interviewing people about doctrine and polity in the United Methodist Church. They have to write these papers, somewhere between 24 and 28 pages long, where they answer all these theological questions, and then we ask them a bunch of questions about what they answered, kind of trying to pick it apart. So by the end of Monday and Tuesday, I was ready to stop talking about theological things for a minute or two, in spite of the fact that we had some good candidates come through. We only had one person that we had to ask to repeat that process, but everybody else did pretty well, which is always so encouraging to see the new clergy who are coming into service. The reason I brought that up, though, is because one of the people focused pretty heavily on Genesis as a major text for one of her theological questions that she answered, and she got into some of the same things that we have talked about between Genesis 1 and Genesis 3 regarding the Imago Dei, being created in the image of God, the nature of God speaking about God's self in a plural way, and it was encouraging to hear some of that same scholarship coming out in some of her answers. I hope that as we work our way through this, what you're learning about Genesis is going to be helpful to you in your own study. So let's go ahead and go into it. The flood has come to an end. Now, we've talked about the flood as a decreational event. So essentially, the waters of the deep and the waters above, the waters of chaos, have been opened by God. And so there's a couple of thematic elements there. One is that it reinforces the Hebraic view of the world, right, as chaos being held back by the structure that God has put in place to hold chaos back so that life can thrive. But seeing that the thoughts of the human heart were only evil all the time, God opens the waters, opens the dome and the ground holding back the waters of chaos, allows the waters of chaos to flow in, and that essentially is supposed to give you the idea that the world is being brought back to the same state that it was in Genesis 1, when the Spirit of God, the breath of God, which is Ruach in Hebrew, Ruach Elohim, is hovering over the waters of the deep. So we have the waters of chaos taking creation back to kind of a level playing field, except that the major difference now is that instead of creating up out of the ground, the word Adamah, Adam means from the ground, of the ground, or from the ground. Eve means life. There's an interesting juxtaposition there then about when you take a look at how the ancient Hebrew people might have read this. It would be akin to if we were telling a story in English and the story were a creation story, and instead of naming the actors in that story Adam and Eve, or Bob and Wendy or whatever, we literally named them human and life. It kind of changes how you read the story when you're talking about the intentional naming of that. So Adam, human, life from the ground, and Eve is life. And we see that in the original part of, in the early part of Genesis, God creates from the structure that God has put in place. So out of the creation, out of the ground, out of the ashes, God creates, right? This time, even though the world is being brought back to a similar state that it was in Genesis 1, with the waters of chaos hovering over the surface of the world is there now, right? There are a lot of scholars, I don't know if I said this when we were talking about Genesis 1, who see the Genesis 1 and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters of the deep or the waters of chaos. They see that as in a similar light to the way that they see this flood story, in that the waters of the deep are covering something that is already there. But then Genesis kind of goes through the creation process after that of how some of those other things are created. So that scholarship, in my humble opinion, gets a little bit murky, but I think that the timeline of the story gets a little bit murky to follow anyway. Regardless, what you're seeing here is an intent to give you the idea, give us the idea that the world is returning to that state, formless and void. The major difference is that things are there right now. And so instead of recreating again, God preserves what was created before. And what was created before is what is going to be used to repopulate once the waters of chaos recede. In that repopulation, and we're going to find this in this chapter, God is going to lament that the waters of the flood and the decreation event that happened, followed by what is ostensibly a recreation event, that does not change the nature of the human heart. The human heart remains ostensibly oriented toward evil. We're going to see that at the end of chapter 8. So God's going to make a promise. And interestingly, my guess is that if you grew up in a Sunday school class, you probably presumed that that promise was made to you. I'm going to take you through that point of the story in just a minute, because it's not. The promise is made in spite of humanity. So let's go into that. The chapter 8 begins with God remembered Noah. The word that is translated to remembered is used several times throughout the Old Testament, and it doesn't mean remembered in the sense that, kind of in the way that you and I would use that colloquially today in our language. God didn't forget about Noah, and then all of a sudden was like, and anytime you see that in the Old Testament in particular, it does not mean forgotten and suddenly, oh, remembered Noah, like it's a psychological act. That's not what it means. The way it's used there, and the way it reads when you read it in Hebrew, it comes across more as God was faithful to what God said God was going to do with Noah. God had made a promise, and God follows through on that promise. So it's not that God remembered in the sense that God had forgotten, but more that God remembered, God followed through with the promise that God has made. When we studied Hebrews together, one of our favorite phrases, or mine, from that was that God will do what God has said that God will do. You see that here. So when you see God remembered so-and-so, God remembered Moses, God remembered Abraham, God remembered Noah, read that in the context of God was faithful to what God had said that God was going to do. So God remembered Noah. all of those alive and all the animals with him in the ark. This is important. In my very first seminary course that I ever took, the professor in that course said that you've probably read the scriptures from a perspective that's oriented primarily to yourself. And we're like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, you probably read them looking for the elements of the scripture and the scriptural message that speak to your salvation. And we're like, yeah, probably so. He's like, the funny thing is that if you just look at the teaching statements of Christ, Christ talks about the redemption of creation literally 10 times more than Christ talks about anything related to the personal salvation of a human. And so, we made the mistake of challenging that, which led to an assignment that he had already predictably put in place where we had to go and compare all those statements. And sure enough, I don't remember, it's been like 15 years since I did that, but it was right around, the numbers were right around 10 times. He was obviously right. About 10 times as much. So why do I bring that up? That theme runs through this whole chapter. Right here, you're not just seeing that God remembered Noah. God remembered all of everything that God had created. The redemption story of the Bible is not just the redemption story of humanity. It is the redemption story of God's creation, of which we are a part. Interestingly, we sometimes forget to hold in tension the notion that it is humanity that is responsible, according to the story of Genesis that we've just read, particularly chapter 3, that it is humanity that is responsible for the dysfunction of creation, the way that creation is dysfunctionally interrelated right now, because humanity, as we've talked about before, decides that we can make decisions for ourselves apart from God, throws all of creation out of whack. So here what we're seeing is not God remembered the human. The word Noah means rest, to rest. Should have told you that already, which is interesting, because in a minute we're going to read that the ark came to rest in the Ararat Mountains. When you read that in Hebrew, it says that the ark Noed on the Ararat Mountains, which is just not, it's not a big deal, but it comes across as an interesting play on words when you read it. So what you're getting here is not God remember the human. Now, I'm not trying to say, so don't misinterpret that humans don't matter to God. That's not what I mean at all. But what the scriptural story says is that humans have a specific role to play within the context of all that God has created. Are humans important to God? Yes. But in spite of the fact that we are important to God, we have a role to play and a place within God's creation. And sometimes we like to behave as if our role as stewards is more of a role of, how would I say this? That we're more than stewards, and we end up using God's creation to our own benefit and for our own purposes, instead of stewarding God's creation, which is what we were actually made to do, in deep, personal, and meaningful relationship together with God. So what you're going to get here is God cares about all of creation. Now, there's a wonderful theology of stewardship that ends up evolving from that. If God cares that much about all of creation, should not we be doing that as people who profess to follow Christ, as people who are in relationship with God, as people who are created to be stewards of that which God has created? Should we not be as concerned with the status of creation as God is? It's a good question to ask, followed by, are we? What are the ways in which we abuse creation for our own benefit? Sandy Richter, she, as I've told you, is one of my favorite theologians. She wrote the Epic of Eden. She also just recently wrote a book called Stewards of Eden that I listened to in audiobook form during my morning runs for a couple of days, and she's been lecturing about this. She takes a look at the theology of stewardship in the Old Testament and brings some of those passages out in a pretty powerful way. I would recommend the book to you if you have any interest in creation theology or stewardship of creation. It's a wonderful book. But you're getting that here. God cares about all of creation. And we should not read that as to the exclusion of humanity, but humanity is a part of that creation. And God cares about God's creation as much as God cares about the rest of what God has created, i.e. us. So God was faithful. God remembered. God was faithful to what God had promised to Noah, to all those alive, to all the animals with him in the ark. So God sent a wind over the earth so that the waters receded. Now that is meant to be kind of a very similar reference to Genesis 1. Let's read that again. Genesis 1. When God began to create the heavens and the earth, now do you get this? This is where scholars will go with that. When I said a minute ago that there are a number of scholars who are going to say that the waters of the deep in Genesis 1 are covering something that's already there, listen to that, because I'm in Genesis 1 right now. It says this: when God began to create the heavens and the earth was without shape or form, and it was dark over the deep sea, right? So it says when God began to create the heavens and the earth was. And the statement there is a statement of existence, of pre-existence. So scholars have really struggled with this. Theologians have struggled with this. I don't know. I would love to give you a definitive answer about it, but like so many other things in Genesis and in the Scriptures, it's confusing, right? But let's go a little further. The earth was without shape or form, and it was dark over the deep sea. And here we go. God's wind swept over the waters. Here we are in Genesis 8. God sent a wind over the earth so that the waters receded. The Hebrew phrase there, Ruach Elohim, is the same. The Spirit of God, the breath of God, goes over the surface of the waters so that the waters begin to recede. Now, in some of the other flood stories, I think in particular it's the Sumerian epic, in which I believe, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think it's Utnapishtim who kneels down at the feet of the sun god after coming off of what is the ark in that story, and the sun plays a role in drying up the waters that have covered the earth. And if I'm not mistaken, and I probably am, I think it's 7 days and 7 nights that flood rages in the other Mesopotamian stories. Here, what you see is no reference to the sun whatsoever, right? A lot of scholars believe, and I think this is probably accurate, that you're seeing kind of an intentional pull away from the stories of other cultures in the region that want to focus on a sun deity. And here what you're getting, because remember, there's a whole lot of teaching in the Old Testament that says, take some of the stories from the surrounding region that are common to everybody, and it essentially says, your stories are kind of right, but they're also a little wrong. There's not a pantheon, there's one God, right, with a heavenly court, but there's one God. So what you see here, I think, if you compare this to the other stories, I'm going to do that in a minute. I'm going to read to you part of one of those stories that has to do with the birds going out. But when you compare them, you get kind of an intentional pull away from a sun god reference. That's probably not going to make a lot of difference to most Christians who read this today, because we don't have a lot of Christians, I think, who are probably tempted to worship a sun god. But that was a common thing when this story is being told and eventually written down. So you see that's supposed to be an explicit reference. It's God here, and it's God's breath, the breath of God, Ruach Elohim, over the waters that is causing, once again, the waters of chaos to recede. So we also get an image again that God's divine will is more powerful than the waters of chaos, which Hebrew people, again, traditionally, mythologically, were very afraid of. The springs of the deep sea and the skies closed up. So the breath of God causes the springs of the deep and the sky vault to close up so that the waters of chaos begin to recede. Excuse me. They begin to close up. The skies held back the rain. The waters gradually receded from the earth. So after 150 days, the waters decreased, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day, the ark came to rest on the Ararat Mountains. Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. So the time is really very specific, right? On the 7th month, on the 17th day, that's when the ark came to rest on the Ararat Mountains. The waters decreased gradually until the 10th month. On the first day of the 10th month, the mountain peaks appeared. So what are you getting here? The ark comes to rest, but you still can't see any peaks of the mountains. The water has to continue to recede. Why? Because the ark, part of the ark is obviously going to extend below the surface of the water a little bit. That comes to rest. The waters continue to recede. All of a sudden, they can see other peaks. This is not a reference. What you're not getting here is that the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat. In Hebrew, this word is plural. It says the mountains of Ararat. Now today, originally that was an ancient kingdom, or in an area of an ancient kingdom called Urartu. Today that would be eastern Turkey. And so there's a mountain range. This mountain range is in what is today eastern Turkey. A lot of mountains there, plenty of mountains. One of the other epics has, one of the other Mesopotamian epics has the ark coming to rest on Mount Nasir, which is somewhere, if I'm not mistaken, to the south and I think to the east of that mountain chain, pretty significant distance away. Mount Nasir is like 9,000 feet tall. The tallest of the mountains in the Ararat chain is about 17,000 feet tall. So you're not getting an exact location for where the ark comes to rest. And that has been the subject of a lot of debate for a long time, and more than one expedition to try to go and figure out where the remains of this ark might have been. There have been a lot of stories, theories, and conspiracy theories about that, and they range from the probable to the just mildly entertaining. You know, like everything from this is a story of the seeding of Earth from extraterrestrials who came from another planet, and that's how the story works itself out, and it was actually a spaceship that landed there, ranging from that to the early humans disassembled the ark and used the wood from the ark in their early dwellings, which is a large part of the reason why nothing can be found of it today. There's a lot of theories there. Nobody knows for sure what they are. You probably know that because I'm sure you've watched some History Channel documentaries about it too. A lot of people thought they found it. Nobody knows for sure. But what you're getting here is not an exact location. You're getting an exact time. It's not on Mount Ararat. It's in the Ararat Mountains. That's what it says. All right, so the first day of the 10th month, the mountains appeared. After 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made. He sent out a raven, and it flew back and forth until the waters over the entire earth had dried up. Now, the raven doesn't come back, right? So the raven is a bird that eats carrion. Most likely, I think what you're seeing here, and I think a lot of scholars agree with this, is that the raven finds food at the upper regions of the mountain peaks and doesn't have to come back because it finds something to eat. But then the dove is going to be released. Dove is a valley dweller, and so when the dove brings something back, they know the waters have receded enough for them to disembark, right? So I'm going to read through this, but then I'm going to read one of the other stories of the flood from antiquity that reverse that order. Most scholars, period, kind of agree with the biblical order because it makes more sense to release the birds in that manner because of the nature of the bird, right? You're trying to figure out here when it's okay to come out of the ark. Let's read through it. So he sent out a raven. It flew back and forth until the waters over the entire earth had dried up. Then he sent out a dove to see if the waters on all the fertile land had subsided. But the dove found no place to set its foot. It returned to him in the ark, since waters still covered the entire earth. Noah stretched out his hand, took it, and brought it back into the ark. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out from the ark again. The dove came back to him in the evening, grasping a torn olive leaf in its beak. Then Noah knew that the waters were subsiding from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent out the dove, but it didn't come back to him again. In Noah's 601st year, on the first day of the first month, so on New Year's Day, the waters dried up from the earth. All right, I'm going to read this to you. I brought this in today so that you could hear the comparison. So let me pull that up. All right, so this comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it is that epic in which the story has the boat landing on Mount Nasir. Here's what it says. I sent forth and set free a dove. The dove went forth but came back. Since no resting place for it was visible, she turned around. Then I sent forth and set free a swallow. The swallow went forth but came back. Since no resting place for it was visible, she turned around. Then I sent forth and set free a raven. The raven went forth, and seeing that the waters had diminished, he eats circles, caws, and turns not around. That is on the 11th tablet of the Babylonian version of the epic, which was written around 750 BC. And so you've got a couple of interesting things there. The order is different, right? And if you're looking for, factual consistency, that's bothersome. But it shouldn't be lost on us that there's such a similarity between these two stories coming out of vastly different cultures about this one event. That in and of itself, even though the order is different, the fact that there is so much overlap lends a lot of credibility to the idea that what we're seeing here is a narrative of an actual event that took place that was remembered by more than one culture and codified into their history and their religious practice. So you've got a different order there. I think the order here probably makes the most sense, but that's one of the passages in that story that kind of corroborates this idea that you're really looking at an actual historical event that's codified in different cultures. All right. Verse 13b, so the waters dried up from the earth. Noah removed the ark's hatch and saw that the surface of the fertile land had dried up. In the second month, on the 17th day, the earth was dry. In the second month, on the 17th day, the earth was dry. So we're going to go back to chapter 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day, on that day, all the springs of the deep sea erupted, and the windows in the skies erupted, right? So the waters of chaos come through. On when? The second month, on the 17th day. Here we are. This is verse 14 in chapter 8. In the second month, on the 17th day, the earth was dry. What do you get out of that? They were in the ark for a full year. So they were in the ark during that time for an entire solar year, 365 days. So God spoke to Noah. And so at this point, Noah has not really said anything. Time and again, we get this idea that God speaks to Noah, and Noah is faithful to what God has told Noah to do. In every instance, now Noah is aware already, because of the sending out of the birds and the opening of the hatch, that there's dry land. But Noah waits to disembark until given the command by God to do so. And we see that time and again. Noah, apparently, and I think this is, we've talked about the difference between teaching Bible study and preaching. And so if I'm preaching on Sunday morning, I'm looking for the kind of lesson the Spirit wants to pull out of the text so that we can hopefully apply that practically to where we are all at right now and what we have coming before us in the next week. If we're going to do that here, there's a great lesson that comes out of this whole Noah story, which is that in every, what you can't help but connect Noah's response to God with the idea of original sin in the first place. We've talked so much about how the concept of original sin is that humanity decides for itself that it doesn't need God in order to make decisions, right? And so in so doing, we make poor decisions because we don't know enough to make good decisions. We think we do, but we don't. And so, I mean, we've talked about that. But here you have Noah, where every time a decision is necessary, Noah defers to the direction of God, which is exactly what the issue, the opposite of that, is the issue that would be described as original sin. Noah is doing the opposite consistently of what original sin is. Noah is not choosing that Noah knows for Noah's self what is the right thing to do. Noah is following the direction of God. And what we see in the biblical narrative is that every time Noah follows the direction of God, it works out better for Noah and Noah's family. Now, you probably got this in Sunday school as well, because God gives Noah some direction that's outside of the bounds of normalcy, right? God comes to Noah and is like, there's going to be a flood, build an ark. And everybody's like, Noah, you're an idiot. You remember those stories from Sunday school, right? Noah does it anyway. Noah's faithful, builds an ark. Lo and behold, God was right. So what do you get out of that? From a preaching Sunday morning kind of a perspective where we're pulling out a lesson, even when we don't understand, and we don't do it in a vacuum, when we believe that we're discerning direction from God, we check that against the Holy Scriptures, our community of faith, and our spiritual mentor. And I don't mean this in a funny way, because people have believed that they have been told by God to do some heinous things, like kill their own family members or something. So we check those things against the Scripture, against our community of faith and accountability, and with our spiritual mentor. But when we're hearing something from God, even when that something from God seems like it's something we don't fully understand, right? Noah didn't fully understand why God was telling Noah to do what God was telling Noah to do, but Noah was faithful to what God had commanded. Noah follows through. God is faithful to what God has said that God will do, and as a result, Noah ends up time and time again in a better circumstance because Noah is faithful to the guidance of God. That is the opposite of what causes the fall. So what you're getting here is an example that humanity, in spite of the fall, humanity with free will, not only has the opportunity to choose to take on for itself, by itself, and to itself, the ability to choose for itself what we're going to do apart from God. Humanity can do that, but we can also choose to be in relationship with God and follow the guidance of God, right? We have that choice. We can do either one. When we choose one of them, things go badly, and half the time we don't understand why because we don't even know enough to understand why. When we choose the other, following in the example of Noah, things tend to work out better than when we don't. So there's a story there that is narrating a theology that is hopefully not lost upon its ancient Jewish readers or us as well. Noah is faithful. God spoke to Noah, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife, your sons' wives with you, and bring out with you all the animals of every kind, birds, livestock, everything crawling on the ground, so that they may populate the earth, be fertile, and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out of the ark remember, at every point we've seen God's command, and then we kind of get this reiterated version of what we just heard, right? But that reiterated version of what we just heard is nothing more than the scriptural story of God said to do this. Here's how Noah was faithful to what God said to do, right? So Noah went out of the ark with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. All the animals, all the livestock, all the birds, and everything crawling on the ground came out of the ark by their families. Okay. Noah, first thing he does when he gets out is build an altar. So Noah's first act after getting off the ark is to worship. This is the first mention of an altar in the Bible, is right here. Now that does not mean that Noah has never worshiped before. In fact, there's a statement earlier that kind of gives the idea that it's common. Noah's worshiped before. But the salient point here is that the first thing that Noah does upon getting off the ark is give thanks to God. Give praise, thanks, and glory to God. Presumably, for a lot of things, not the least of which is that the nature of the story of the flood and of the ark includes a significant lack of something that you see in the other cultural versions of the story from Mesopotamia. In the other Mesopotamian versions of the story, there are expert navigators on the boat who help to make sure that the boat does not capsize. But here, we have an absence of expert navigators, and scholars have talked about that, comparing the stories. Why is it that all the other versions have expert navigators on the boat, but here in the Hebraic version of the story, we have no navigators on the boat, and it's God, for instance, who shuts the door of the ark, right? We have this divine action where God shuts the door and seals them into the ark. What is all that supposed to mean? Most scholars come down on that here, that the idea that's being communicated is that it is by God's grace and God's grace alone that the ark survives the flood. So there's a statement of providence there, right? God's providence has been a theme throughout the entirety of Genesis so far. It will continue to be a theme throughout the entirety of Scripture. But the idea with regard to the flood is the boat only survives the flood because of God's grace. So what does Noah do in response to God's providence, to God's intervention, to God's protection, to God's guidance? The first thing he does is to worship, which is and that's going to set a foundation for the manner in which this religion is going to teach us how to do what we do. The first response, and there's several ways to say this, but the first response, the best response, the most appropriate response to God's providence, to God's intervention, is worship. What is worship? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. Because a lot of the time, especially today, we're living through a time when worship, and I don't mean this badly, so don't take it that way, but worship is really very consumer-oriented today. And that is because of freedom of religion, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think freedom of religion is a good thing. But I think even good things have unintended consequences, right? And so one unintended consequence of that has been that you and I as Christians are free to go to whatever church fits our preference and our worldview. One of the things that I tell our leaders when they come onto the administrative team here at the church, and we all struggle with this, we all do. And I think that we have to be honest about that struggle and identify it lest it overtake us. One of the things I tell all of our administrative team members when they come on, Orville has heard this from me more than once, is that we cannot make decisions for the church based upon our own stylistic preferences. We can't make decisions to guide the church based upon our stylistic preferences. If you're in a leadership role, we can't do that, right? You and I, as Christians, though, we're free, as we worship, we're free to go to a church or leave one church, go to another church that either fits one of a couple of things, our worldview or our stylistic preference. And so because of that, it's a natural step for churches to then say, well, what do we need to do then to attract people in? Do you hear that? Well, we've got to be kind of careful to pay attention to stylistic preferences and the worldviews of our demographic. Because it's one thing, ministers are supposed to preach prophetically, as well we should. And there are a lot of people who want that, so long as, listen to this, your prophetic preaching aligns with what I already think is right. If your prophetic preaching is a little bit too close to trying to tell me that what I think is wrong, then, and we'll take a certain amount of that. To some degree, I'm trying to be humorous, but there's also some truth in it, right? So worship in the time that you and I are living through has become fairly consumerist, and we're all responsible for making it that way. Everybody, the whole Christian community is responsible for making it that way. Does that mean it's healthy? Probably not, and I'm going to suspect that there's going to be a natural evolution of that finds us with fewer churches, probably in the very near future, and I think the pandemic helped to spread that up, or speed that up. So the right response, and this is how the religiosity of ancient Judaism is going to develop in a very particular way, and that is for the right response to God's providence to be worshiped. So one of our questions has to be, what is worship? Like, when we worship, what are we supposed to be doing, right? Worship, ostensibly, is really just about a couple of things. And interestingly, and I'm going to say this and you're going to balk at it, but it's very, very true. Worship is not about God. Worship is about you. Here is why. People are going to be like, no, worship is all about God. No, it's not. God does not need your worship in order to thrive. God does not need my worship, your worship, our worship. God doesn't need it at all. You know who needs it? You and I. We don't need to be worshiped, but we need to engage in the act of worshiping God in order for our souls to be oriented in the right direction. God does not need that at all. There's no part of worship, there's no part of anything that God needs. God is completely self-sufficient in all things in the way that God is. God is completely whole, which begs the question, what is worship? Who needs it? You and I need it, but we don't need to be worshiped. We need to engage in the act of worship. So our worship is oriented towards God, but God in God's great wisdom knows that worship is about us orienting in the right direction because that's the healthiest orientation for us to have, and also brings us into relationship with God, which is, guess what? Something we need, right? So what is worship? Worship is when we orient our hearts toward God in thanksgiving and praise. So we give thanks to God for the things that God is and has done, God's providence, God's intervention, the bounty of creation, the opportunity to be alive, and we also praise God. We give God praise for those things because it is an orientation of our heart towards God in the act of giving praise that orients us in the right direction. Very first thing that Noah does when Noah gets off the ark is to worship. Sunday, so in the ancient Jewish calendar, and we have reoriented this to some degree as Christians, but what was the Sabbath day for ancient Jewish people? Still is for most practicing Jews today. It's going to be Saturday, right? But it's actually evening. In the ancient Jewish calendar, evening is the start of the day, right? So evening Friday to evening Saturday is the Sabbath. Some Christians in America tried to kind of reorient that to make Sunday the Sabbath. And so you may have grown up with this idea that Sunday was the Sabbath day. That was a movement that happened early on in the evolution of Christianity across the American frontier. But traditionally, the Sabbath was evening Friday to evening Saturday, and here's why. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And God rested on the Sabbath. We read about that, right? Saturday's the Sabbath. On the seventh day, God rested. We're supposed to rest also seventh day, and then the seventh year, in the year of Jubilee, we're supposed to rest. So you've got all those things, right? But the worship for the ancient Jewish person, and this comes across in most practicing Jewish communities today, worship is considered work. When we worship, we are working, right? And so the very first, and this evolves from this practice of Noah. First thing Noah does, Noah could have done a lot of first things, right? Probably a lot of things that needed to be done. What does Noah do? Sacrifices those things and worships. The first thing Noah does is worship. So that evolves into this. The first thing we're going to do as ancient Jewish people, and then subsequently, this carries over into Christianity. It's why we still do this on Sunday. We don't just worship on Sunday because we've always done it that way, right? Some things we do, I'm going to go off on a tangent for a minute, so pull me back if I get too far off. But I heard this story the other day. If you've never sat down and talked with Michelle, Michelle has the best stories. She just has the greatest stories. So she's telling me this story about a teacher, and this is like a fable. She's telling me the story about a teacher in India. And this teacher, really respected teacher, right? Everybody wanted to come to hear this teacher. And this teacher had a cat. And the cat, while the teacher was teaching, everybody loved the cat. But the cat would run around and rub up against people and get on the tables and distract everybody. And so at one point, as much as everybody loved the cat, somebody said, hey, we ought to do something about this because the cat's really distracting, right? So they get the bright idea. The area that they're teaching in is like an open-air courtyard, right? So there's a tree at the edge of this open-air courtyard. And they're like, well, why don't we just tie the cat to a tree during the teaching? We love the cat. We don't want to hurt the cat. We want the cat around, but just so it's not distracting. And they're like, okay, let's try it. So they tie the cat to a tree while this teacher is teaching. And lo and behold, it ends up working okay. The cat's no longer a distraction. Well, the teacher actually passes away before the cat does. And another teacher comes in, and they keep this cat because the cat has been part of their community. It kind of reminds them of their former teacher, right? Well, time goes by. People come and go. Teacher comes and go. Cat dies. And when the cat dies, they're like, well, what do we do? And somebody's like, well, we've got to get another cat. And they're like, why? And they're like, because you have to have a cat tied to a tree while somebody's teaching. That's the way we've always done it, And so they buy another cat, tie the cat to the tree, because they've always done it that way. There has to be a cat tied to the tree while the teacher is teaching, right? Some of the things we do simply because we've always done them that way, and we have no idea where that came from, right? And Michelle's way better at telling that story, but it's a funny story, right? Some of the things that we do just because we've always done them that way. Well, we don't just worship on Sunday because we've always done it that way. We worship on Sunday because Sunday is the first day of the week. Instead of being productive, we sacrifice productivity so that the first thing that we do in the morning of the first day of our week is worship God, to give thanks and praise to God and orient our hearts to God at the beginning of our week. The very first thing we do is orient our hearts to God. That's why we do that on Sundays. Now, for a large period of particularly American history, people stopped working too much on Saturdays and Sundays, and so we kind of moved from sacrificing productivity to sacrificing recreation. Sunday became Sunday Fun Day. And so if you were going to come to church, you were sacrificing recreation and rest and whatever. Now the world has moved back more into a 24/7 work ethic, and so there are plenty of people who are working on Sundays again, and we're all struggling with how are we going to handle that ethic. But that's where that evolves from, and it comes from here. The first thing that Noah does is to worship God. That leads to this religious idea. Religion is not a bad thing. That has become a four-letter word. But my definition of religion is the manner in which we choose to practice our faith. I think that we can institutionalize that poorly, and I think that we can live into religion in an unhealthy way, but I don't think religion itself is a bad word. So the religiosity that develops here is this idea that the first thing that we're going to do is worship, hence the reason that we do that on Sundays. All right, so he does. He builds an altar. First mention of the altar. He took some of the clean large animals and some of the clean birds and placed entirely burned offerings on the altar. Okay, there's two things here, right? One of them, if you're like me and you're reading that, you're like, this is the first thing that happened when he got off the ark. we saved these animals so they could repopulate. I sure hope they had already started that process before they, sacrificed them as entirely burnt offerings. Because if not, doesn't it make you wonder what animals no longer exist in the world today as a result of that? Maybe that's where unicorns went. I have no idea. But most likely the animals they've been on the ark for a year. So most likely you're talking about animals already having had the opportunity to reproduce. The other is this. Has anybody ever told you what the word for entirely burned offering is, the ancient Hebrew word for that? The ancient Hebrew word for entirely burned offering is Holocaust. 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 Now, if you look that up, look it up on Google, get a definition. You're going to get two. You're going to get one that defines it as what you know it as. And then below that, you're going to see an ancient historic definition that it is an entirely burnt offering. And that is the evolution, the etymology of that word is the reason that word was used in that context with what happened to the Jewish people. Entirely burnt offering. Several kinds of offerings, but the entirely burnt offering, and I presumed you probably didn't know that, wanted you to know the etymology of the word there, but that's what an entirely burnt offering is. It's actually, the first part of that word is hollow, and it's pronounced kind of nasalized with an H. So hollow means entirely burned, and the suffix meaning offering. So there's an entirely burnt offering, and the scent from the offering is a pleasing scent to the Lord. You're going to see that later in the Old Testament with regard to the burnt offerings and sacrifices. Now, in the other versions of this story that exist in antiquity, one of the first things that happens when the people disembark from their boats is that they give food offering to the gods in their pantheons, and some of those stories talk about the gods hovering around those food offerings hungrily because they haven't been able to eat for 7 days while the flood was happening. There's a bit of anthropomorphism going on there. You see in the ancient Hebraic stories, again, you kind of see this co-opting of cultural stories with the idea that your stories are kind of right, but they're also not kind of right. So, and one of the ways that they're not right is that we don't feed God. We don't need to feed God, right? The scent that is pleasing to God is something that scholars have talked about for a really long time, as is the nature of sacrifice as a worship act and as a means by which we atone. So an altar is built here, and an altar is used. The purpose of an altar is sacrifice, right? Just to give you some context and a little bit more information, what we have here in our ministry center that you're going to find in most Protestant and mainline churches is not actually in the Protestant versions of the church, and that's a whole conversation in and of itself, is not normally called an altar. You will find it called that in most Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches, but in Protestant churches, it's not actually properly called an altar, it's called a communion table. And the idea behind all of that has to do with the one oblation of Christ, or the one offering of Christ, that Christ's sacrifice is a one-time sacrifice that renders any subsequent sacrifices as unnecessary. And so you have some versions of the faith that choose to use the altar/communion table in the capacity of remembrance of that one oblation of Christ, and others who call it something different to emphasize a whole other part of the theology, that since we no longer sacrifice something on the altar, it now represents for us the table around which Jesus sat and instituted the Last Supper. Subsequently, early Jewish/Christian worship, so early Christian worship post-ascension, focused on meals around a table. And the communion table is meant to represent that more than it is meant to represent the idea of sacrifice. So the evolution of that is in that capacity. Our early forebears, early Christians, shared meals together on the first day of the week, and they would remember the sacrifice of Christ in the breaking of the bread and the drinking of the juice, which is what Christ said to do. That evolved over time into rituals that had liturgies. And then in order to accommodate more people, we moved away from tables and into auditoriums where we had a symbolic table at the front of the auditorium. And then versions of Christianity developed where people even didn't participate in that process so much as they watched a priest do it on their behalf. So it's evolved tremendously over time from what was originally a meal, which makes the meal that we share at the homeless outreach one of the best examples of communion that is alive and well today. Okay, here we go. Let's finish that up. The Lord smelled the pleasing scent, and the Lord thought, now get this, the Lord thought to himself. The Lord thought to himself. So this is not a promise that God makes to Noah. This is a promise that God makes to God's self. Okay? That's important because you were probably taught that the rainbow is set in the sky as a promise that God will never do this again to humanity. It is not that. I'm going to read through this and I'm going to teach it to you. God thought to God's self. So God is deciding for God's self. I will not curse, listen to this. I will not curse the fertile land anymore because of what? Human beings. Since the ideas of the human mind are evil from their youth. So I will never again destroy every living thing as I've done. As long as the earth exists, seed time and harvest, cold and hot, summer and autumn, day and night will not cease. So what do you get out of that? Well, first, that is not a promise to humanity. God is deciding, that's something God has decided for God's self. But what God is saying there is that I am never again going to punish the rest of creation because of humanity. Here, all of creation gets punished because of humanity. What God is saying is, in spite of the fact that the flood does not seem to have changed the inclination of the human heart, I'm not going to make the rest of creation suffer anymore because of humanity. Now, does that mean God hates us? No. Does it mean that we are the biggest issue that we have? Yes, it does. The inclination of the human heart is the biggest. One of the things that I've said over and over again over the years is that you will never legislate away the problem of evil in the human heart, no matter what we try to do. Evil in the human heart is something that is changed, healed, and transformed through relationship with God. Hence the reason we do what we do. And that brings us to the end of our time together. So we're going to go into God's covenant with Noah, or with all life in the next chapter, chapter 9. We'll be taking a look at that next week. We are going to have the study next week. So next week is Holy Week. We will have the study Thursday morning. I'll be here. And then we'll also, of course, have the Holy Thursday service, Maundy Thursday service on Thursday night. We're not having a Good Friday service this year. We're going to do a Maundy Thursday service on Thursday evening that combines some of the components of both instead. Okay, let me pray with and for you, and then we'll get on with our days. God, we're grateful for the opportunity to learn together because we know that the opportunity to learn helps us to be able to better reflect on the lessons that you would seek for us to learn from your Holy Scriptures. So God, we pray that as we have the opportunity to learn and grow, that we would do so in dialogue with you. Help us, God, to seek you out as we process new things that we're learning and questions that arise from those things. Even as we process those questions together as a community, help us to seek you out and process those questions together with you, to think through things together with you, so that as a result of our time together and as a result of what we're learning and growing into, we might also know you better. This we ask in your name. Amen. Thank you for coming.